Are we on? Oh, look at that. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Jeff Phillip. I am the president of the Board of Trustees, and I'm welcoming you today and calling your attention to some of the items in our order of service. First thing I want to mention is that hopefully you have all heard that Reverend Zachary will be resigning in a few weeks. So you can refer to some of the messages that have been coming out and know kind of what that timeline looks like, and know that the old Board of Trustees and the upcoming Board of Trustees are looking at how we continue to do our important work together and keep us moving forward. I'd like to also note that we don't have a musician this morning. We were not able to line somebody up. We've got a number of artists that come in frequently, but nobody was available today. But thank you to Carolyn and Audrey, who recorded the music that we're getting from the ether someplace up there. You'll note on the back of your order of service, we have Super Supper this coming Tuesday at 5 p.m. at Eagle Harbor Congregational Church. There is a meditation group on June 26th at 5 p.m. at Cedars. Our annual report, we're asking folks in the different committees to submit updates on what occurred this year. So you can send those to me or Carolyn Kearns at the office, and we'll assemble that. This is the last day of General Assembly. I noted this morning when I got up and looked at my email and notifications that the Article 2 proposal had passed with an 80% vote. So we will have a new set of values and purposes, and I don't think it'll change all that much other than the way we kind of talk about some of the things that we do. On July 10th, we will be doing the Suquamish Community Kitchen. That is a larger community dinner feed, and there's a sign-up sheet at the back. So if you're available on July 10th, we could use your support to help put that on. Last time, I think we prepared about 110 meals. Is that right, Rod? Yeah, something like that. And then I'll also note that on July 27th, the Bainbridge Pride Festival will occur in Waterfront Park in Winslow. It would be nice if we could have a booth there to represent Cedars. So if anybody is interested in helping to set something like that up, please reach out to me and we'll see if we can make that happen. Thank you and good morning.
Where's my glasses? This is a relatively new thing for me. We are called to gather in worship as a beloved community. We are called to set aside distractions and anxieties that we might touch deeper springs and be renewed. We are called to seek and share comfort for the things that may hurt and afflict us. We are called to seek more love, more justice, and more life abundant. We are called to truth, to mercy, humility, and courage. Let us answer the call with the yes of our lives.
Disclaimer. I have permission from my partner, Jeff, to share this story. I see him taking a deep breath. Many of you have heard this story. In the newlywed, naive, inexperienced era of our marriage in the 90s, early 1990s, we got married in 1990. Jeff and I moved to Umatilla, Oregon for his first job as a park ranger. Shortly after moving there, we bought our first house, 66 Polk Avenue, a three-bedroom rambler on the edge of a cornfield at the end of a cul-de-sac. We were expecting our first baby. Life was full of anticipation and dreams of an amazing future, which we definitely had and are still having. But back then, I had this story in my head of how we should be a couple, how we should present ourselves to the outside world. This was particularly important to me as we became the new family on the block. I wanted to become best friends with my neighbors, have backyard barbecues, watch each other's kids, become a little neighborhood ecosystem that worked together, and because of all of our varying gifts and contributions, we were better together. Well, this did happen. We were on the same baby timeline for all three of our kids with our friends across the street, Deborah and Brian. We went through our pregnancies together and supported each other for 7 years until Jeff and I moved back to Washington with our 3 kids. But because in my young and very narrow understanding of how Jeff and I should comport ourselves as a new couple in a new neighborhood, according to all the lessons we'd been handed down from our ancestors and, of course, what society told us we should be like, a simple incident occurred that, in my mind, eviscerated our chances of ever being accepted as a normal couple in the neighborhood. I thought we'd be shunned, ignored, that neighbors wouldn't want to get to know us, our reputation as a great addition to the neighborhood gone before it even began. One day, in the first week after moving in, maybe the first day, I don't remember anymore, Jeff had a great idea that he just read about for removing all the bloomed dandelions in the front yard. There were lots of bloomed dandelions, and we just couldn't have it. He went out there with a dustbuster and vacuumed up all the dandelions. I wish I had a video of him bending over, going from section to section, and methodically hoovering up the weeds. I was mortified. What on earth would people think? Who does that? Who vacuums their front yard? My husband, as it turns out, he's the one who vacuums the front yard, Jeff. And it worked. That's the thing. It worked. So he never had a thought of, will this look stupid? What will people think? And to this day, Jeff still operates like that, with a confidence and absence of self-consciousness that seems so freeing. It works for him, it really does, and it's really something to aspire to, which I've been doing since we've been married. So after that day, I realized a couple things. No one really cares what you think, or what you do. People are not thinking about you all that much, if ever, even if you do something embarrassing or cringy. I also realized that doing something different is not scary if it produces an effective outcome, which Jeff's yard vacuuming did. It can be viewed as revolutionary rather than eccentric and quirky. Doesn't really matter. My friend across the street would bring it up every once in a while at play dates and laugh that Jeff vacuuming the yard was their first impression of us. But we became great parenting allies and good friends. I dedicate the lighting of the chalice to uncomfortable moments. We all have them. Let's not overthink them or dwell on them too much. Nobody else does. Please join me in the affirmation printed in your order of service. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly because we are one family, to take good care of the earth because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness, because that is how we'll all become the best that we can be.
Our opening hymn today is 1023 in the Teal book, and this is our fourth time, so you're supposed to know it pretty well. And there's some advantage to that. I want to point out that a round is a cheap way to achieve harmony, but it doesn't work if you don't hear it. So since you're so good at this now, I want you to listen to the other side while you're singing your own, okay? Then you'll get the full feel of it, okay? So we'll start. Group 1, I'll be over here. Group 2, we'll do it 2 times.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. As we look ahead to the heart of what I'll be sharing in a few minutes, I'd like us to take a brief moment to pause and reflect on our own stories. Maybe you have one similar to what Nancy shared. So get yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and take a deep breath, and let it out. Now, first, what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and try and recall an instance in your life when you did or said something embarrassing, or at best, really uncomfortable. This isn't something traumatic or terribly upsetting, but rather something that if you could go back in time, you'd absolutely make it not happen. Something where there was at least one person, possibly more, who saw or heard this. Okay, now wash that from your mind. And now I'd like you to think back and see if you can recall a time when you witnessed something that someone else did that was likely embarrassing to them. The kind of thing that they might have just recalled a second ago. Okay, we'll come back together. So how did that feel? Was it uncomfortable? I would say don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to share with anyone what you were thinking of. What I will ask you to do is to keep those two things in mind as we think about more about the why, or perhaps one story, why perhaps one of those stories was much easier to retrieve from your memory banks than the other. Okay. Right, keep that in your mind.
For a centering moment, I want everyone to close their eyes and take a deep breath. And let your eyes stay closed for a minute or two. Or 30 seconds, that's better. We are cedars, with or without a minister. Nothing that has happened in the past week changes the fact that we are cedars. Here's a sonnet to Orpheus by Rainier Maria Rilke, part 2, number 12. Want the change. Be inspired by the flame where everything shines as it disappears. The artist, when sketching, loves nothing so much as the curve of the body as it turns away. What locks itself in sameness has congealed. Is it safer to be gray and numb? What turns hard becomes rigid and is easily shattered. Pour yourself out like a fountain. Flow into the knowledge that what you are seeking finishes often at the start, and with ending begins. Every happiness is the child of a separation it did not think it could survive. And Daphne, becoming a laurel, dares you to become the wind. So every Sunday, we take some time to share our joys and sorrows. If you do have a joy or a sorrow, please come forward, share your name, and in a couple of brief sentences, your joy or sorrow, and place a stone or water in the bowl. Stone for sorrow, a little bit of water for your joy. sorrows that go unspoken, and some water in the bowl for the joys that we hope you'll share with us eventually.
Our centering hymn is number 128 in the hardback book.
We pass the offering baskets each week at Cedars as a reminder that the offering is symbolic as well as practical. We know that it is through pledges that we build our budget and fund our yearly programs in ministry of worship, pay our staff, and finance the comfort and beauty of our worship space. We know that we could easily submit those pledge checks to the church at any convenient time. But we pass the plate during our worship service to make a community expression of thanks for the blessing of abundance, to visibly bring in the harvest at this most cherished hour of our week. Our offering says that the act of giving is as essential to our spiritual well-being as anything else we do here on Sunday mornings. If you are visiting us for the first time, please let the basket pass you by. We're simply happy to have you here with us today. Will the ushers please come forward for the offering? Thank you for your generous gifts.
So as we are now officially moving into summer, I know that for many folks this is a time for moments of deep breathing and thankful reflection. When I think about how we've survived the 8.5-month winter season, and hopefully we finally get the reward of a warm and sunny stretch that we've been waiting for. Those of us who have soldiered through more than a few years in the Pacific Northwest, we understand the local mantra, if you can't handle the winters, you don't deserve the summers. So for many people, it's also a time to embrace the need for desire or for travel plans, especially at the time when it was vacation time for your kids. And looking around, I think those of us who have kids, maybe those kids are kind of out of school now. But it was, for me, I know for me, it was could kind of be an exercise in contradiction. And I think about when I was teaching and an administrator, vacation time was kind of a give and take. I know for me, it was the time for my own kids' break, and which in its own way kind of negated the whole vacation feeling for me, because then the kids were at home. But be that as it may, summer was the time for the travel bug to kick in, as it was really the only time that I could easily get away, in spite of the fact that summer is really the best time of year to stay close to home here. Be that as it may, Shane and I are very lucky to have been able to see a good deal of the world in our travels. From the early days of backpacking and hostels on a shoestring budget, to now where we will gladly pay a bit more so we can actually have air conditioning and a private bathroom where we're staying. Now, with travel, inevitably comes stories, and I've told a lot of them over the years. But there's one in particular that stands above the others, and I know Shane hates when I tell this story, so you have to bear with me. At least it's the first one that pops into my head if someone asks about memorable travel experiences. And it's a great story, but it's not the best one to launch right into with just anybody. But I know that I'm among friends here, so I'm going to take that risk. Now, first, I want to explain why this particular story so easily finds its way into my recall, especially as I'm here at Cedars today. Some years ago, Shane and I attended a Cedars gathering at somebody's house, and I can't remember whose house it was. And I'm pretty sure that I knew most, if not all, the people that were there. And at some point, people started sharing travel stories. And maybe it was stories about memorable food, I don't know. I can't recall the detail, but when it came to be my turn, I knew exactly what story I was going to tell, because it had been a hit with every telling that I'd ever done. Now, it went back to Shane's and my first trip together, our very first big trip, the month that we spent backpacking through Southeast Asia, nearly 28 years ago now. Well, in the early part of our trip, we traveled to the town of Mae Hong Son, a beautiful little village in Thailand near the border of Myanmar. It was such a wonderful place, I really could have told a dozen different stories that night. But the one that I chose to tell was the one about the time that Shane and I stopped at a little roadside cafe and ate the most delicious dish you can imagine. Now, again, I don't recall the details of it, other than that it was a bit spicy, but not horribly so. And I'm pretty sensitive to spices, and I managed this just fine. Now, I'm going to spare you the most unpleasant details about this, but some of you might be seeing me for the first time. So suffice to say that about 4 hours later, I started to experience this noisy gurgling from right in here. It wasn't painful at the time, but it was somewhat foretelling. It's like watching your backyard as thick black clouds are forming in the distance, and you don't know when it's coming, but you suddenly realize that it is, and you want to make sure you're someplace inside when it does. And sure enough, right at the time that we were settling for bed, it hit me. And again, the vivid details aside, let's just say that I discovered that the volume and variety of spices in that meal were making themselves clearly known to me, from beginning to end, in a fiery journey unlike any experience I'd ever had. I can only say that I was glad that we had chosen a place with a private bathroom, and I imagine that anyone who lived within hearing distance of our guest house that night might have thought someone was getting a tooth pulled without the benefit of Novocaine. Now, looking around in here now, I can say that you're all taking this in a lot better than the group at the gathering that night. And I gave more details that night than I did here. And the one thing I didn't mention about the Cedars event, we were actually seated around a large dining table at a formal sit-down dinner in the middle of a lovely meal when I chose to tell this particular story. And again, with probably about 30% more details than I just did. Now, this was probably 15 or so years ago, and I can say that while the details of what we were eating that night and the conversation up to that point are fuzzy, I can still see the looks on people's faces like it was yesterday. In fact, the memory of that moment, right down to the pit of my stomach, recurs in my mind about every 6 months or so, triggered by any number of things. So that's a cringe moment. And when I asked you to think of a moment in your memory that was embarrassing, I imagine that you were able to come up with one or more pretty quickly. But when I asked you to think of an incident that you witnessed someone else's cringeworthy moment, I'm wondering if it took you a bit longer to come up with that. And if so, why was that? How did your feelings contrast from one memory to the other? The feeling that you felt when remembering your own cringy moment versus someone else's. Was there that same embarrassment toward yourself versus perhaps empathy or an understanding for the other person's? Now, I can flip through the Rolodex of my mind and easily pull out dozens and dozens of cringy moments. 3rd grade, complimenting a classmate on her artwork, and instead of saying, "I love it," I shout, "I love you." Telling a joke in the staff room on my first year teaching, a joke in which I soon realized I didn't fully understand the punchline, and the shocked looks quickly told me that what I had thought was funny really wasn't at all. Or the time in 8th grade when I wore what I thought were my own jeans to school, only to find out midway that they were my mother's very pleated mom jeans. Now, I know that most, if not all of you here today could do the same. We all have these moments of embarrassment. Doesn't everyone experience this same thing, the constant, involuntary reminder of a particularly cringeworthy moment? Now, of course, as we look at the notion of the cringeworthy moment, I want to make clear that I'm not setting out to minimize or make light of those memories that are more difficult. Moments in our past that go beyond embarrassment and fall into feelings of shame or humiliation or even trauma. Those are much heavier and perhaps worthy of a different sermon than the one I'll be giving today. Now, I did some reading on this very thing, the what and why of this phenomenon of the constant reliving of cringy moments. And it turns out that most everyone does go through the same thing, but not all. A science writer by the name of Melissa Dahl, D-A-H-L, is the author of a book called Cringeworthy, A Theory of Awkwardness. And the book is full of reflections by a good many people about this very thing. Among the anecdotes and various theories is this, postulated by James McGaugh, a neurobiologist who studies memory. And McGaugh theorizes that in the instance of a cringeworthy moment, something excites your brain, like the laughter of peers or the looks of horror at something you've accidentally said or done, which triggers the release of adrenaline, which in turn releases another substance called noradrenaline, a neurotransmitter that perks up the amygdala, which is a part of your brain. That's a region of the brain which gets excited by emotional arousal, he says. The amygdala then communicates with almost every other region of the brain, and it's basically saying something important just happened, make a strong memory. Interesting. But there was another piece that stood out to me. In one case, the author Dahl asks a man to tell her about an embarrassing memory from his past. And even though she'd provided the question several days earlier, he isn't able to give her an example. She goes on to explain that this man is one of just 60 or so people in the world who is thought to have a highly superior autobiographical memory. They call it or HSAM, a condition that was discovered in 2006 by scientists at the University of California at Irvine. Now, according to her, this man could remember nearly every day of his life in vivid detail. And the more the author thought about it, the more she was dying to know, what would it be like to remember your embarrassing moments when you remember everything that's ever happened to you? And again, James McGaw was part of a team of scientists who first discovered this HSAM, the phenomenon where people remember every detail of their lives. And he expanded on his theory about noradrenaline and the amygdala to consider why the men in her book with HSAM had such a hard time recalling an embarrassing episode from their past. And one reason their memories may work the way they do, he says, is that everything that's registered at the same emotional level. That's why all the mundane details of their day-to-day lives are so easily recalled. For instance, he'd offhandedly mentioned a date in the mid-2000s to one of the men, and that man immediately knew that that was the day he had gone to see the movie A Beautiful Mind. So basically for these men, everything is emotional, then nothing in particular is. It isn't that these men couldn't remember embarrassing moments, it's just that those moments don't stand out more vividly than any of their other memories. So meanwhile, this mere mortal here is left to still wonder what causes a particular cringeworthy moment to be so tenacious in my mind. For me, it could be triggered by an obvious connection or a reminder of the event. It can be random and seemingly unconnected. For instance, I might be lying in bed just drifting off to sleep, and suddenly I'm hit with the memory of me in those mom jeans. And before I know it, I'm realizing and I'm staring at the ceiling, replaying that whole scene over and over and over again, sometimes altering my choices as if I could will history to change itself. Because I'm positive that everyone sitting around that dining table almost 20 years ago at Cedars can recall every single detail of my Thailand story. And in fact, they're probably on some secret group chat right now, like still talking about it. And of course, the truth is they likely, hopefully, would need to be explicitly reminded of it, and maybe even then the whole thing would be nothing more than a foggy memory. But I still remember it like I remember saying hello to some of you this morning. So what can we do about it? In everything that I read, the disappointing thing is there's really not a lot we can do to shut off these intrusive, uncomfortable reminders of our own humanness, of our own fallibility. Except that there's that right there. We can accept that we're merely human and we make mistakes, miscalculations, foibles all the time, and so does everybody else. And the truth is, those errors that we make now and then typically don't spark the same level of adrenaline for those who happen to be in the room when it happened. Unlike us, their brains are probably not getting the message to remember forever that thing that you just did. In fact, they may not even remember what you did at all, much less replay it in every detail every 60 to 180 days. As much of a downer as it is to admit, we're just not that important. So you think, wait a minute, we're not that important. We're not such a big deal after all? So what does a statement like that do to a person's self-esteem? Isn't positive self-esteem exactly what we need to get through those cringeworthy moments? Well, actually, Dahl writes that studies on self-esteem usually find, unsurprisingly, that people with a lot of self-esteem really love themselves. And when asked, they tend to rate their own performance and personalities a lot more favorably than others might. According to studies, greater self-esteem can actually make the reality of how others see you harder to bear. Let's say that again, that greater self-esteem can actually make the reality of the way other people see you harder to bear, harder to deal with. In other words, the more we think of ourselves as awesome, the harder it is to handle when we find out that in the eyes of someone else, we're just not as awesome as we might think we are. So in contrast, researchers discuss the notion of self-compassion, how it allows us to, quote, judge ourselves as others do. Okay, so it turns out that self-compassion is a version of self-awareness that lets you acknowledge at once that you are a living, breathing human being who now and then makes mistakes. even sometimes really ugly ones, while also putting those mistakes in perspective. One researcher explains it like this. He says, when we arrive at this kind of self-awareness, when we fail, it's not poor me, it's rather, well, everyone fails. Everyone struggles. This is what it means to be human. It helps you see yourself, and it also helps you see beyond yourself. So the writer, Dahl, continues by saying that she's decided to call it self-indifference, the relief of realizing that you're simply not that big of a deal. The best, if counterintuitive, way to truly feel better about yourself is to see yourself as you really are. So maybe that sounds harsh. Self-indifference is essentially a synonym for humility. And while some might understand humility as having a low opinion of yourself and your status, most contemporary scholars see it differently. Humility, they say, is simply knowing your place. Humble people tend not to focus on themselves. They look outward just as often as they do inward, understanding themselves as part of an interconnected whole. You matter, but only because everyone matters. Now, we raise our kids to be proud of themselves, to try and ensure that they have the highest self-esteem that they can. They should be the stars of their own world. And we tell ourselves the same things, giving ourselves the kind of affirmations that will allow us to move through the world with confidence and pride in our abilities and talents and achievements. But what this study is telling us is that a good dose of humility can go a long way. While it's okay to imagine the spotlight on us now and then, it's important to know that there are as many spotlights out there as there are people. And no one performer has all eyes on them at the same time. In fact, sometimes the only one looking at us who gives a damn about the thing that we just did, whether it was awesome or super cringy, is us. It could be why earlier you may have found it easy to come up with your own cringy moment, but struggled to recall someone else's. And it's as it should be. So if you're sensitive to cringe attacks, then according to Dahl, you're already in a great position to start become a little more humble. A cringeworthy moment can be used as a reminder that yours is not the only perspective. Or it could become a reminder that you aren't alone in your embarrassment. It's not a feeling that's unique to you. Everyone shares it to some degree or another. The secret to surviving cringe attacks, to shut the memory away, isn't to try to tell yourself it wasn't really that bad, Dahl says. Instead of focusing inward, turn your attention outward, onto the people around you, around the dinner table maybe. Some looking back at you, some not. Because while you're special, you're not always the most special one in the room. And isn't that a great thing?
I invite you to stand for our closing hymn, number 1008 in the Teal Book.
Wisdom
Please repeat after me as I extinguish the flame of our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth.
Extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth.
The warmth of community or the fire of commitment.
The warmth of community, the fire of commitment.
These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. So after the words, the quiet, after the songs and the crowd, only the memory recalls the gathering. As we go from here, let us be humble, for the worst things in the universe are made up of the same stuff that we are. All the same, let us be confident and optimistic, for we are also composed of the same stuff as the very best. Okay, good.